Hello, beautiful community. We have to talk. And that's because my friend John Stuart Mill has come back from the past. He actually died in 1873. And he's been doing me a favor. He's been having a look at you, a look at this community, just to make sure that you're behaving. And he's given me a report. And he's actually got a problem with some of your behavior. And as a result, I'm going to have to put you, my community, on the naughty step for 10-15 minutes as we deal with this. This is very serious. So what John Stuart Mill has reported to me, and you got to give him respect here, he's actually traveled 150 years from the past, is that some of you have been going around and calling contrary political positions to yours on the Ukraine war disinformation and misinformation. And he tells me that you've been calling these positions disinformation and misinformation because you think they're wrong and because you think they are really damaging and harmful. And he's just reported this to me, and I was completely flabbergasted that some of you have been misbehaving so much. So we've got to talk about it. And the way we're going to do the naughty step situation is that we're going to say something very sort of light first, and then we're going to get to the big point second. But the light point is in itself important enough. So let's start with it. When the Russians do disinformation, they typically don't do it in the form of seeding of factual error. They typically do it in the form of messing up our information environment, giving us contrary messages, trying to confuse us, trying to make us feel, well, we'd better get exhausted with this Ukraine war, we'd better get both morally and epistemically exhausted with it, because after all, it's getting harder to work out exactly why this is carrying on and why it's happening and why should we be doing this to prop up Ukraine. Surely it's time to think about giving. So that's the kind of thing Russian disinformation is trying to do. That's the kind of thing Russia's relatively minor disinformation campaigns during the 2016 presidential election in the United States tried to do. They weren't saying facts X, Y, Z aren't facts, but something else is a fact that isn't. They were in fact saying things like, well, this is good, this is bad, this is terrible, and that's exciting and worth doing. And in the process, they were trying to exaggerate conflict, exaggerate tension, exaggerate toxicity that was already present in US political discourse. What does this mean? It means that we have got a real kind of concept creep that is creeping into our behavior, whereby we're going around and we are at risk of labeling things that are misguided positions we don't share, as though they were disinformation. But they're not disinformation. They are contrary evaluations to our own evaluation. And they might be there because of error, or they might be there because of an intent to poison the informational environment by a certain agency or by a certain state. So you could call misinformation just stuff that's flat false, and it's swimming about without being a product of a clear intent to deceive, a clear project to deceive. And disinformation is misinformation with a politicized project to deceive or confuse attached to it. I mean, that's not good, but that'll do for the purpose of our conversation. Well, a lot of what we find challenging isn't disinformation. It's not disinformation when Jeffrey Sachs argues we should stop supporting Ukraine. It's not disinformation when people go on the Joe Rogan podcast and say maybe we've helped Ukraine enough and it's time to wind this thing down. It's a contrary view. It's a view that happens to be contrary to my own view, and indeed my own views to some extent even contrary to our current policies in the West, because I advocate an even more hawkish position of support on this Ukraine conflict. I think we should do even more than what we're doing for Ukraine. And that's not because of compassion, but because of key strategic interests that are our strategic interests in the West. And by the West, I include Eastern Europe in this conversation. So that's very important. Let's not go around labeling as disinformation people who disagree with us and even disagree with us dangerously. Because in the end, especially if they're fellow citizens, those people who are disagreeing with us, they're going to share a table of politics with us. Disagreeing painfully while continuing to talk and coexist and not trying to deplatform each other is absolutely the lifeblood of democracy. Because when democracy loses the crutch that is the crutch of civic belonging, where at least to some extent citizens feel, well, I have these different identities, but one of them is that I'm a citizen of this country. And that is an identity I do share with citizens who are my political opponents. Once you get rid of that unifying civic identity completely, and the United States is currently on the precipice of losing that, you end up in a situation where your democracy will last so long as your institutions are resilient enough to cope with the toxic consequences of this loss of civic identity. And that means that if your institutions are strong, they could last a decade or two, and then they'll collapse unless new solutions and new ways forward and new ways of civic engagement, civic connection appear. So it's very important that we don't do concept creep about disinformation and misinformation, and we confine it to matters of fact rather than to evaluations of the world that might be dangerous or wrong. This was just a small misbehavior that John Stuart Mill reported to me. He reported a much, much bigger misbehavior, and a kind of a much more innocent misbehavior, actually, but a more profoundly consequential one. And that's that we are looking at people getting facts wrong and people thinking about the world outside the realm of factuality. In other words, people are now separating not into what we were just discussing, evaluations, interpretations, things that we don't want to call disinformation and misinformation. But things have got so bad now that people are segmenting into mental bubbles that are also fact bubbles. And large modern states have not got anywhere near developing a capacity to generate reasonable consensus on straightforward matters of fact. In fact, we are increasingly losing that capacity rather than gaining it. That's the trend at the moment. And what this means now, this second deeper problem, is now a problem where we will talk about matters of fact, where we're not talking about interpretations anymore, but we are actually talking about people either believing things that are glaringly factually wrong, or things that have just, as it were, closed the door on tethering to factual reality. And what I want to say here is that it's also wrong the way we are labeling citizens who are wrong in this way or detethered from factuality in this way as being, as it were, an expression of disinformation or misinformation. And you might say, well, hang on, you've just said that we should confine disinformation and misinformation more closely to factual error. You are saying these people are factually wrong. What is wrong with saying that we've got a crisis of disinformation? What is wrong here, and this is the crux of what we're reaching for, is that underneath the crisis of disinformation, there is a crisis of trust. And we have talked a bit about different pathologies of distrust that we're seeing in the West. And I think there are four, and I won't stop talking about them. The least worrying one is one that just says, I as a citizen feel unsafe with my political institutions, with my public institutions, with my public health institutions, and that's because I think they're incompetent. Yeah? So they're incompetent, I feel unsafe, is the first sort of view plus the cartoonish emotion tied to it. The second position of fracture of trust goes deeper, and it says, well, my institutions are betraying me. They're not just incompetent, they're kind of corrupt. Perhaps they're prioritizing the wrong people. They're not prioritizing me, they're prioritizing some others, maybe some outsiders, or just some others in my society who shouldn't get the priority they're getting. And I feel betrayed by them. So they are sort of traitorous. The third view point here is about powerlessness. So here I feel that my institutions are going on in whatever way they're going on. They might be incompetent, they might be, as I perceive them, corrupt, might be betraying me, but they're also untouchable. There's nothing I can do to reach for them. I try, and it's like turning a wheel in your motor vehicle, but the wheel's not turning. And maybe, yes, it's meant to be the case that voting or getting involved in politics at some level is meant to make a difference, but it doesn't. It almost feels like I just can't inflect the political process at all. It's just going where it's going, and I'm meant to have a sort of a 0.001% capacity to influence this stuff, and I don't feel it, and I don't feel anybody has it, and I feel it's zero. So that's the first three pathologies of mistrust, right? Feeling unsafe, feeling betrayed, feeling powerless. But none of them compare to the fourth and worst pathology of mistrust. That's the feeling of being lost. That's when you look upon your public institutions and you don't feel they're unreachable, untouchable. You don't feel that they are working against you, that they're inept. You feel that they're unintelligible. It's got to a point where this stuff is just bizarre and it makes no sense to me. And the image I use to exhaust you, because I've used it several times already, is an image of looking out onto a game of sport where three or four games are being played at the same time. Well, dishes is a good slip. It's like watching a kitchen situation where something is being prepared that is in fact a case of four different dishes mixed together that could not possibly work in any kind of constellation. And so it doesn't make sense what is going on. You are seeing chocolate mousse with gherkins in the same thing. I mean, what is this? I feel lost. This is not making sense to me anymore. It's almost like we've turned the page and the previous rules of politics just don't apply. So what is all of this? And that creates the feeling that maybe we can just get rid of it. Maybe we can just swipe and start again. And here, there's a very, very key concept, which is a concept of magical thinking. Yeah? And when philosophers typically talk about citizens entering magical thinking, what they're talking about is citizens entering a realm that goes beyond cause and effect. So, to make this cartoonish, the thought is that a citizen who hasn't given up on cause and effect will think, well, if I vote for that bunch of people, this is what they might do or try to do by those means in that time frame with the help of these processes and institutions, and these could be some of the results. So there's a kind of this could be wrong, but there's a bit of a causal chain here. So these ones are gonna do this with taxation policy, so I'm gonna go for those. So this is all thinking that could always go wrong, could always be wonky, could always be misreading, but it is thinking that is inside the frame of cause and effect. With magical thinking, something else happens. I want to vote that person in, but I no longer have any clear account in my head of what they're going to do for me, how and in what way. It's almost a feeling that all I'm doing here is just turning the page and hoping that something happens after that seems impossible today. So there is this magical thinking, but there is also this other kind of psychological trick, and that is a kind of distinction that perhaps is just an expression of magical thinking between past and present. Once we get that person in power, they will do X, Y, Z, and then politics will make sense. Or then the politics that doesn't make sense will be given a good bonk on the nose, and that'll be good. But there'll be new possibilities. But I don't know how they're going to come about. Or we're going to have a referendum about whether to have one or another kind of relationship with the European Union. But if it goes my way, then something new will be possible. We will turn a page. And moreover, the way we get to this turning of the page doesn't matter. So we can kind of misbehave and beat up our democratic institutions on the way to this page turning event. So feeling of being lost, the feeling that you want to give up on institutions, the feeling that you want to give up on thinking in terms of cause and effect, the feeling that you want to have a sort of a magical separation between today and tomorrow. All of that is going on underneath a situation where a citizen is sitting there and thinking, this is true, when in fact we know that it isn't, that it's factually wrong. Or when a citizen is sitting there and not even saying anything false, not even persuading themselves that something that is terribly far from the truth is the reality, but kind of just imagining their political world in a way that simply no longer is in friction with a kind of a minimal tissue of factuality. Yeah. So what that means is that even when it comes to citizens who are saying things that are just wrong, right, factually wrong, or who are thinking about their politics in a way that is detached from factuality, what is going on with them is a crisis of trust. And it's not a crisis of disinformation. The crisis of disinformation is a shallow misconception, right, as a label about what's going on. And so the bottom line difference is, if you understand this properly, then the cartoonish thought you end up with is there are processes of democratic degeneration in my society that I've got to think about deeply. Right? That's the right place to end up in. The wrong place to end up in, some bad people are doing well politically, but that's because citizens are just being really irrational and really dumb and they should wise up. Some people are being irrational, possibly with the help of malign disinformation enterprises by foreign states. One pole. Another pole, there are deep mechanisms of fragmentation of trust in my society and real pathologies of democratic degeneration that I've got to engage with. And that's different to going around calling people irrational. So I think that the time is now the correct time for us to get off the naughty step, and John Stuart Mill will be very proud of us. Really grateful to you for enduring this, because I know this was off the cuff and not brief. Lots of love and talk very soon.